Good evening and welcome. My name is Megan Lovett, and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to each of you for joining us tonight for the kickoff of our fall webinar series. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this by offering presentations such as this one, as well as online courses, videos, podcasts, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our fall online courses are underway. Our next cohort of courses begin on October 7th. Upcoming courses include The Joy of the Gospel, Old Testament Narrative, and Ignatian Spirituality. If you are interested in learning more about our online courses or would like to enroll in a course, we will include a registration link in the chat. Thanks to our speakers for granting us permission to record today's webinar. Tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email with details about accessing the recording when it is ready. At the end of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer. Please feel free to enter a question into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. Finally, we are also able to offer live closed captioning for today's webinar. Please click on the closed captioning button on the bottom of your screen to enable the feature. Many thanks to Dot and Carolyn, graduate students at the STM, for providing the closed captioning for us today. I now invite Father Thomas Stegman, Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speakers.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Faith and Citizenship, Catholic Perspectives on American Politics. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists and our moderator. And let me begin with our panel. Our first panelist is Father Matthew Malone of the Society of Jesus, the president and editor-in-chief of America Media. Father Malone entered the Society of Jesus in 2002 and was ordained a priest on June 9th, 2012 by Edward Cardinal Egan, the late Archbishop of New York. Prior to entering religious life, Father Malone served as a special assistant and speechwriter to U.S. Representative Martin T. Meehan, Democrat from Massachusetts. From 1997 to 2002, he served as the founding deputy director of Mass Inc., an independent political think tank and co-publisher of Commonwealth, the award-winning review of politics, ideas, and civic life. He is the author of Catholique sans etiquette, a book concerning church and politics, published in 2014 by Salvatore Press in Paris. Father Malone was a founding member of REMIS, Religion, Mimesis, and Society, an interdisciplinary research group at Heathrop College dedicated to the thought of René Girard. He is a member of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion and ministers as the chaplain to the New York Press Club. Father Malone serves on the Board of Trustees here at Boston College, also on the board of the Appeal of Conscience Foundation, and on the board of directors of the Catholic Medical Mission Board and the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. Warm welcome to Father Malone. Our second panelist is Father Samuel Sawyer of the Society of Jesus. He's the executive editor and the director of digital strategy at America Media. He previously served as an associate pastor at Holy Trinity Church in Washington, after being ordained a priest in 2014. During his theology studies, he helped to found the Jesuit Post, the online media platform that offers perspective and analysis of contemporary issues by young Jesuits, and he served as one of its first editors. During his Jesuit formation, Father Sawyer studied philosophy at Loyola University in Chicago and theology here at Boston College. I can attest to that because we lived in the same community for 3 years, and I can also attest to his magnanimity because he's still talking to me. Father Sawyer also taught philosophy for 2 years at Loyola University in Maryland. And before entering the Society of Jesus, he worked as a software engineer after graduating from Boston College and spending a year as a volunteer middle school teacher. Presently in New York, Father Sawyer assists at St. Francis Xavier Church. A warm welcome to Father Sawyer. And our third panelist is Carrie Weber, executive editor of America, where she has worked since 2009. Carrie is the author of Mercy in the City, How to Feed the Hungry, Give Drink to the Thirsty, Visit the Imprisoned, and Keep Your Day Job, published by Loyola Press, a book that received the 2014 Christopher Award, as well as awards from the Catholic Press Association and the Association of Catholic Publishers. Her writing and multimedia work have earned several awards from the Catholic Press Association. And in 2013, she reported from Rwanda as a recipient of Catholic Relief Services Egan Journalism Fellowship that recognized her excellence in Catholic media. She's a graduate of Providence College and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. In 2004-05, she volunteered through the Mercy Volunteer Corps as a special education teacher on the Navajo Reservation in St. Michael's, Arizona. She later served for 5 years as a support person for the Mercy Volunteer Corps volunteers in New York City. She has been a Mercy Associate since 2012 and is a board member of the Nation Solidarity Network. Warm welcome to Ms. Weber. And now I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator, Boston College professor Kathleen Kaveny. A scholar who focuses on the relationship of law, religion, and morality, Professor Kaveny holds the Darrell and Juliet Libby Professorship here at Boston College, a position that includes appointments in both the theology department and the law school. She is the first BC faculty member to hold such a joint appointment. A member of the Massachusetts Bar, Professor Kaveny clerked for the Honorable John T. Noonan Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and practiced healthcare law for 3 years before turning to higher education. In 2018 and 19, she held the Kerry and Ann McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Klug Center of the Library of Congress. Welcome, Kathleen. So thank you again to our distinguished panelists and moderator. You honor us with your presence and your participation here tonight. And without any further ado, I hand this webinar over to Kathleen to begin tonight's discussion. Kathleen?
Well, thank you, Father Stegman and Megan Lovett and Cara O'Sullivan for just such a wonderful welcome to this virtual conversation. Learning how to talk together honestly and in a lively manner on the internet, on the Zoom, as my dad says, is something that we've all been challenged to do over the past months. And I think it's allowed us to create a different kind of community that, although it's more remote in some ways, also has a kind of intimacy that you don't have if you're speaking in a giant lecture hall. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation among the panelists and with the audience members. These are very difficult times, very important times, and America Magazine has long been a flagship publication of the Jesuits, which has helped us to discern how to be responsible for the whole common good, not just the common good of our church, but also the common good of the country and the world in which we live. So your insights, America people, are something that I think our audience will benefit from and look forward to. So I'm going to start with Father Malone, and I want to start first by reading a small passage from St. Augustine that I think will give us a way of thinking about some of the problems we face at this moment of time as Catholics and as American Catholics. St. Augustine was not only a great theologian, he was a working bishop, a working pastor, and he made all sorts of talks and gave all sorts of reflections. One reflection that he gave, I was struck by in these as I was preparing for this panel, and it was a little sermon he gave at the dedication of a brand new church in his diocese. And he distinguished between building a church, the physical place, and building the community, which he called the house of God. And this is the quotation that struck me the most. Quote, "But Christians do not make a house of God until they are one in charity. The timber and stone must fit together in an orderly plan. It must be joined in perfect harmony, must give each other support, as it were of love, or none would enter the building. When you see the stones and beams of a building holding together securely, you enter the building with an easy mind. You are not afraid of it falling down in ruins. The work we see complete in this building is physical. It should find our counterpart in our hearts." So St. Augustine, with this beautiful passage, is talking about the unity that we should have as the body of Christ, as the church. But if you just pick up the internet, pick up the iPad and search your normal websites, you don't see any kind of unity really in the church, particularly around political matters. So my first question to Father Malone is really, what do you see the causes of this polarization are? Do you think it's getting better or worse? Is there any way forward? Are we doomed, to live this way until the second coming, and then Augustine helps us build a new house of God that's a little bit more secure? How do you think about that set of questions, polarization in the Catholic Church, particularly around political issues?
Well, first of all, I should say thank you very much for allowing us to have this American Media staff meeting. It's wonderful that I can be here joined by my colleagues and my friends, Kathy, and of course, Boston College, which I love. It's interesting that you should mention Augustine, because one of the things that I've read a lot about in my life has been the work of Bill Kavany at DePaul, who's a really wonderful political theologian. And in his work, he reminds us that, that the two cities, the city of God and the city of man that feature at Augusta, they are not physical spaces in the sense in which we would understand that. They are really performances that we enact out across time and space. But also as a church in ways that transcend time and space. That's important to remember, I think, because the source of our unity then as a church is not a party political platform. It's not our assent to a set of propositions per se. It is, it's not whether we live in the same neighborhood. The source of our unity as a church, which is a metaphysical reality, is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? We're not merely one out of many. We are many made one through the sacrifice of the one. Now, that can just sort of sound like, a bunch of abstract words and notions, but I think it's crucially important that we remember that as a church, because it actually allows us then to disagree with one another without those arguments then being a dagger in the heart. Those arguments then become thorns in the side. And there are arguments going on in the church. There have always been arguments going on in the church from the very beginning. That's part of our human reality. But if we can lower the stakes of those by remembering how it is that we are already connected to one another by through the Christ event and through our devotion to this person in the church that comes to us as gift, then we can actually enter into a conversation in a way I think that Pope Francis is encouraging us to, which is not as a confrontation, as a battle that has to be won at all costs, but as a genuine encounter. Some people think that this sort of way of thinking about things, about the church, actually, papers over our differences. I think it's actually what makes our differences possible. And even more important, it's what makes it possible for us to discern a way forward together. This is exactly what Pope Francis was talking about in his historic address to Congress, which just took place at, this month is the anniversary of the Pope's visit to the United States. He identified this issue of polarization as central. And I don't think that he had in mind simply the obvious problem that any consumer of the Western media would see, as he would, in the United States, but also what's happening in the church. Because there are ways in which that we as a church have, that we have simply imported the categories of our secular politics into the church, and that our debates, our disagreements are often structured in exactly the same way. And you see that playing out in the course of this election about which candidate can we vote for as Catholics in good conscience and so forth. But I think there's also another way of looking at it, which is to say that this election actually affords us an opportunity to remember the richness of Catholic teaching and how it transcends the categories of our secular politics. That we as Catholics who adhere to a body of social teaching that comes to us from the gospel, that are not represented in either of the major political parties and in either of the major nominees for president. But there are parts of what we believe that are represented in both of them, and that I think is that is important for us to remember. But it's also, if we can then, by having a dialogue with one another as Catholics that is more respectful, that's more intelligent, then we can act as a leaven to the larger culture by providing a model through which they can do it. There is, if we don't have the freedom to be wrong, then we don't have the freedom to have an argument in the real sense of the word. John Courtney Murray, the great political theologian who was also an associate editor at America, he always made the point that real argument is actually a tough thing to have, because you have to agree on some basic premises and you have to agree on some basic data, right? So what we think is argument, what we're seeing both often in the church and certainly in our secular culture, is not actually argument. It's a kind of, it's a fight to the death. And it isn't, for the most part, it is an argument about territory, about space, and about the all-important need to be right. But I think we have to remember as Christians that same gospel that inspires our moral values, the principal lesson of that is that the object of Christian discipleship is not to be right, but to be holy.
That's extremely helpful, and it's very beautiful and inspiring. It's a little bit abstract, though, if you think about the gritty realities that we're facing on a day-to-day basis. If you open the newspaper or your iPad websites, when I open those websites, I see a lot of Catholics participating in cancel culture within the church. That what you end up with is a lot of Catholics, yes, fighting about politics, but also using politics to find a way to cancel other people's membership in the church because they don't believe something can be worked out in the same political way. So do you have anything practical to recommend? Anything that might help us overcome Catholic cancel culture before we start turning to American cancel culture?
Yeah, I would say that the same tradition that bequeathed to us Augustine and these other insights that I've made reference to also gives us a language to understand some of what you were just talking about. And it's very inclusive language. It's words like sinner and idolatry. They're in some sense the most inclusive language, because we're all sinners and we all have idols. And you know, there is a lot of ink that has been spilled in academic journals and in magazines like America over the last several years talking about the causes of polarization. And they're many and varied. They have to do with demographics. They have to do with how news is structured by the marketplace, the proliferation of social media. It has to do with the fact of the way that we congregate in communities. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to me that 2016 was one of the closest elections in American history, and yet 65% of Americans live in a congressional district that voted for Clinton or Trump by 20 points or more. So we don't even live within proximity of people who we are disagreeing with. But the truth is that that's really the wrong question. What are the causes of polarization is not the right question. The right question is who is? And the answer is you and me. I mean, we are the causes of polarization. These are forces that are not happening simply to us, but they are forces we are participating in. And what I often hear is, well, what about Trump or somebody else? Aren't they the principal cause of this? And the answer is, for politicians, they tend to be beneficiaries of polarization. Mr. Trump certainly is a beneficiary of it.
If I could press you on one question, you know,
Yeah.
Jesuits are about intellectual life. Jesuits are also about, you know, discernment and self-scrutiny through things like the Examen. If you could come up with 2 questions that you think would be good for people to ask themselves, not their neighbor,
Right.
in the, you know, in the next 6 weeks, say, is it 6 weeks? I think it's 6 weeks. What would those questions be? Not pretend, you are, for the moment, spiritual director to our little webinar. What would you tell us to ask ourselves?
I would say, in light of this, ask yourself, how are you complicit in this problem? What are you reading? How are you reading? How are you engaging with other people? Are you engaging at the level of ideas? Are you engaging at the level of identity? Can you actually hear what other people are saying to you? And what are what is that feeling that you get, that sort of rush of adrenaline that comes from clicking like and sticking it to them? Think about that. Pray on that. Like, what does that feel like? Is that a lasting feeling? Is that a feeling that builds you up? Is it a feeling that builds up other people? Is it the sort of, does it feel like it's life-giving? Because if it's not, then those things, then it's not a work of the Holy Spirit. And that's precisely, I think, the discernment that we have to do in our own personal lives at the level of our own personal engagement. And the reason why I think that's so important is because then there's actually something that we can do about polarization. As long as the problem is someone else, then there's nothing we can do. We're powerless. We have to wait for them to do something. But if we can see ourselves as part of that problem and ask ourselves tough questions about it in the way that we would when we examine our conscience, then we can actually begin to do something.
Thank you very much. It would be fascinating to continue this conversation about self-examination and conscience and polarization for the whole talk, but we have a cornucopia of wisdom here. So I need to move on to our next panelist, Father Sawyer. And I think we're going to switch a little bit with you from looking at polarization and its causes to actually turning to some of the polarizing questions in this election and in the church and in the political sphere. And you know, there's nothing really that has been, in some sense, more polarizing than abortion for Catholic voters. Although, I mean, I think you can probably speak a little bit about this. Study after study shows that most Americans and even most Catholics don't place it among the top issues that they're considering as they make their decisions about whom to vote for. So it's a polarizing issue, but it may be a polarizing issue in a particular context, and maybe not in others. It's puzzling. So Father Sawyer, I'd like you to help us solve the puzzle, or at least name the puzzle. The U.S. bishops have said that abortion is the preeminent priority for Catholics in their faithful citizenship document on voting. And some commentators, along with some priests and some bishops, have said that this means that Catholics can't vote for or even be Democrats. I mean, they can do it metaphysically, as in there are some, but they can't do it in an objectively good conscience. How has abortion become not just the preeminent priority in discussions of Catholics in politics, but sometimes, and for some Catholics, seemingly the only question that matters? Can you help us understand the source of this polarization around this very difficult issue?
Well, I can try, and certainly I'm going to be doing more naming than solving of this problem at this point, at least. I thought when we were talking about which topics we would take among ourselves, this is a topic I write on frequently at America, and I thought it was probably necessary to go at this topic directly and by name, because even though it is not necessarily the most fundamental theoretical or moral question, it is practically often the question where these conversations run aground. And certainly in recent days, one of the places where the conversation has run aground around this, who can be a good Catholic and whose political views are allowed in to the space of what it means to be a good Catholic. So I think there's sort of a little bit of quick history and genealogy here. Kathy, as you said, there's tremendous conflict and confusion around this topic. And so we have in the very same surveys, you can have a majority, like almost 70% of Americans saying that they support Roe v. Wade and don't want to see it overturned. And yet at the same time, the same percentage of Americans, presumably not entirely the same people, but some of them, will also say that they support limits on abortion, legal limits on abortion, that Roe v. Wade makes absolutely impossible to implement. So, there's deep conflict here, and what Americans are of at least two minds about abortion most of the time, right? As a country, we don't necessarily want to see it completely restricted, but at the same time, we want more restrictions than our current legal regime actually allows for. One of the things that's happened, I think, I would name two causes here, one from the political side and one from the church side. From the political side, the fact that Roe v. Wade constitutionalized the issue of abortion meant that it effectively got locked up at the Supreme Court. And what this did, I think really unfortunately for our politics, is that it incentivized both political parties to use the issue as a way to contest control of the Supreme Court, which is valuable for a whole bunch of reasons beyond abortion. Right? There are all sorts of reasons that you want to get your party's viewpoints better represented at the Supreme Court, but abortion has become this really powerful engine, either trying to maintain Roe v. Wade at all costs, or else overturn Roe v. Wade because it's the only way to get to the next step of placing any legal restrictions on abortion. This has ended up meaning that everybody fights over, as we're seeing right now, who gets appointed to the Supreme Court and under what conditions. And this is something that I think has prevented the evolution of sort of natural political compromise around this issue, as we've seen happen in Europe in many cases, and as was happening in the United States before Roe was handed down. And I mean, this is not an observation that's novel to me. Ruth Bader Ginsburg made an observation like this in the 90s before she was appointed to the court herself. And Tom Rees, a former editor of America, just wrote a column about this that we actually ran today from Religion News Service on America. I'll put that link in the chat later. So I think that's one of the political causes, is that Roe v. Wade means that there's a strong incentive for absolutists on both sides of the abortion issue to use it to drum up the base, but that doesn't actually get us any closer to a solution, because it blocks any evolution of natural compromise. And then I think the church side of this, what sort of dovetailed with this, is that the evolution of the way at least the American church talks about politics has gotten very focused on moral clarity and moral distinctions, particularly about the act of abortion as evil, and trying to recognize that in law. Now, there's definitely a logic behind that. The logic is basically the sense that, number one, that we know not only from our faith, but also from science, that unborn human beings are members of the human family and their rights need to be respected. And also the deep instinct that it is important for the law to help form culture by making that claim on behalf of all of us together. But I would say that one of the things that's happened as the church has pursued that moral clarity as its primary avenue of political witness on the question of abortion is that we have managed not to look so much at the causes of abortion, right? The contributing factors, the reasons that abortion seems attractive to people or seems necessary. And, as a practical matter, that means that we're also not talking about the sorts of things that really would be the prime issues if and when Roe v. Wade is ever overturned. The question of abortion's legality goes back to the states. Most states would not outlaw abortion, and all the reasons they wouldn't are the reasons that we've spent now, a couple of decades at least not talking about. One of the sort of code words for how this has happened is this preeminent priority language that the bishops have used to talk about abortion, that comes out of the focus on making sure that we never in politics cooperate with any quote unquote intrinsic evils, which is a complicated and fraught topic. And actually one of the absolute best resources on it is an article that, Kathy, that you wrote for America back in 2008. I'll put that in the chat as well. But it's this hyper focus on the nature of the moral act that really ends up, I would say, almost paralleling the way that having the issue of Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court has hijacked discussion of the court. This hyper focus on the nature of the moral act has hijacked our discussion about actual practical ways to work against the prevalence of abortion in society.
Just a follow-up question that's in a little bit different direction. When I listen to you talk about this, one of the things I wish I could do, and maybe somebody could put this in the chat, is say, I wish somebody would go back and reread Pope John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae, because that book about, or that encyclical, which is a book about the culture of life and the culture of death, got encoded in American life mainly by conservatives. If you're a Republican, you're part of the culture of life. And if you're a Democrat, you're part of the culture of death. So be on the side of the culture of life. And that encyclical is not that. It's a beautiful reflection of how all law, including the law that, and policies that support vulnerable life, have to work together, so that it isn't just a question of banning actions that are, that take innocent life. It's also a question of providing support for vulnerable life, like people at the end of their life, for babies, for mothers who are facing crisis pregnancies, for people who need education, for people who are subject of all of those things. Do you see any way, and this ties into Father Malone's point, to kind of get the Catholic Church, the Catholic community, to back away from the polarized discussion of abortion and maybe even return to the riches of the tradition to see the broader set of issues, which I think you're right, will be necessary on the day that Roe is overturned?
That's a great question. I think there's a rich resource in the Catholic tradition and pardon the technical distinctions here, but in the distinction between formal and material cooperation with evil, right? So basically, formal cooperation with evil when you intend the evil thing that you're supporting or assenting to or somehow, helping happen. And material cooperation with evil when what you're doing helps it happen despite you intending something different. And this is a basic distinction in Catholic moral theology, and it's a distinction that was named both by then Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, when he wrote a letter that's become very important on the participation of Catholics in political life. And that same logic has been picked up and used consistently by the US bishops in their Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship document. And basically what that distinction allows us to say is that when we vote, what we're really doing is trying to choose or help choose a set of outcomes, right? And we're not going to necessarily agree with all those outcomes, which would be formal cooperation, the outcomes we're deliberately intending and trying to support with our vote. But nonetheless, it can be morally, not only morally allowed, but even morally praiseworthy to support the moral outcomes that we do intend, even if they come with other political consequences that we might try to work against in other contexts.
That's great.
Anyway,
Yeah, no, go continue.
So just to wrap that up quickly, so I think making that distinction is perhaps a practical route to, as Father Malone was saying, allowing us to disagree with each other in better faith. Because the place we're stuck right now is that it seems like almost everyone is playing an all or nothing game, right? You're in it for all the marbles and your side's going to win the entire battle. And that's simply not the way American politics works. It's not the way our system of government is designed. And everyone will keep being dissatisfied by that. And we will get worse results overall for everybody if that's the way we're actually approaching politics, as this winner-take-all zero-sum game.
Well, thank you very much. And that helps us, I think, transition to our final panelist, Carrie Weber, because we're thinking about voting now. We've thought about faith and discernment and polarization with Father Malone. We thought about, issues and how issues affect how we think about our vote with Father Sawyer. And now I'd like to focus on candidates and their relationship to faith. So my first question for Ms. Weber is this. Much attention has been paid lately to the faith or the lack thereof or the quality of the faith of presidential candidates. But really, it often seems that what begins as an effort to investigate the authenticity of someone's faith becomes more of a political litmus test to see whether they're authentically totally on the right side of a political party, or even a wing of the church that's defined more by its political commitments than its theological commitments. What have been some of the effects of this desire for religious purity, ideological purity, confusing religious purity and ideological purity on both politics and among people of faith who have to deal with politics?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, and thanks very much for having me here today. I think one of the biggest things is that it has left very little room for dialogue. It leaves very little room for people who are actually struggling with issues. Often, I think people feel scared to speak up or say the wrong thing. And in doing so, kind of default to a political group or party that really just offers them the least resistance to membership rather than one that is actually the best fit. And it's left a lot of people feeling homeless in the church and in politics. And the faith of presidential candidates, as you mentioned, has often been up for discussion. But it's funny because these days I doubt that the general public is worried that Joe Biden is going to be taking orders from the Pope, as folks were with Kennedy. It's if anything, I think it's almost the opposite, where much of the criticism of his Catholic faith seems to be coming from his fellow Catholics all along the political spectrum, many of whom feel that maybe he isn't taking enough direction from the Pope on whatever issue it is that they feel strongly about. And I do think authenticity and character, particularly of candidates and and of ourselves in the process of determining who the best candidate is, it matters, right? And it, particularly given the power that goes along with the role that these particular candidates are vying for. But I worry that sort of in an attempt to claim or renounce a candidate, we too often end up creating essentially a witch hunt, right? That betrays the actual core of the Catholic beliefs we're purporting to defend, right? Which is to love one another. It rarely do these discussions feel like they're coming from love or working toward a place of love. In many ways, we've really let, as Father Malone mentioned, that our nation's political divide create those same divisions in our parish life. And I think this kind of demand for a purity of religion or ideology allows us to sidestep the messiness that Pope Francis has called us to embrace. It's really easier to draw lines, but much harder to actually live life when we refuse to allow that messiness and the nuance into our conversations, our neighborhoods, our friendships. But I think for Catholics, the implications of that division within the church are more heartbreaking, right? The church is meant to be a home. The political party is not meant to be your home. It's not going to save you. It's not going to be there for you necessarily when no one else will. The church is meant to do that. But sometimes it really feels like we're allowing politics to dictate who feels welcome in that home of the church. And it goes back to a lot of what you were talking about at the beginning as well, Kathy. And I think really what we need to do is become a church that helps to transform those parties and those politics and the policy as we try to build a better home for everybody.
Let me just interject a little clarifying question here.
Sure.
A friend of mine said, you know, when I was bemoaning the state of polarization in the church, very distinguished scholar, she says, Kathy, you got to stay off the internet. You just have to stay off the internet. If you stay away from Twitter and you keep off all those Facebook pages and you go to church and you work with people in the church and you perform the corporal works of mercy, you know, you're going to see a very different church. I mean, the church on the internet, you know, is not any kind of a church. It's a forum, and it only includes, as big as it is, some subset of Catholics, and that this isn't something that, if we look at, you know, in a broader perspective, really isn't the whole church. Do you have a sense of that? I mean, how much of this polarization that, you know, and you know, litmus testing and that you see on the web has spread into day-to-day parish life activities with kids at church? Is this a computer problem, a virtual problem, or is this a flesh and blood problem? Or am I framing it the wrong way?
No, I think what the internet does is it magnifies things, right? So I don't think that this problem does not exist. I think it exists in a very concentrated, virulent way online that is diffused when we are in person with each other. So I think that there are parishes where people obviously have differing opinions on political issues with each other, but it's a lot harder to say those horrible things to each other in person. And that's a good thing. We don't want it to be easier to say terrible things to each other, right? I think a lot of times, recently Attorney General William Barr was described as being disliked by all the right people, right? And that may be true. It's a common phrase. It's often in jest. But I think the phrase represents something that we all do sometimes, which is conflate dislike with disagree with. And I think there's an important difference between rejecting the idea and rejecting a person. And I think when we are on the internet, we very easily put those two things together. And when we are in person, you see a multifaceted person, right? Like you see, much easier to see Christ in somebody. And I think it's easier to err on the side of disagreement. I think a lot about the friendship lately, as everyone has kind of been discussing, between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia. He talked about the idea that he's quoted as saying, "I attack ideas, I don't attack people." And some good people have some very bad ideas. Now you can disagree with whether he lived that out the way he said he did, but I think it's a good philosophy is trying to be able to see multiple sides of issues and multiple sides of people, and we do that much better in person. But I do think that some of that internet culture seeps into the way we perceive each other online, because it causes us perceive each other in a parish, because I think it causes more to think about those divisions than the unity. And I think it's particularly hard right now at this time in the world, in our life. It's an election season, everything's heated, and no one can go to church, right? Like very few people can actually show up to Mass, see each other in person, and remember that the body of Christ is present in that community and in each other. And that's hard. It's really hard spiritually, it's really hard politically, and I think it makes people feel much more deeply what is happening online and perceiving that as the reality, right? Because right now, for a lot of people, their entire reality is online, right? That's the way we're in touch with each other.
Right. Okay. Well, and here's another question. I certainly, I mean, when we talk about Catholics, we talk about, kind of a general category. And within that category are actually different groups, different subgroups that are defined sometimes by politics, sometimes by age, sometimes by gender. And what do you think? I mean, I hate to ask you this because I sometimes get asked this, but I'm asking you to do this as sort of a favor. I hate to be the only woman on a panel and get asked the woman question. But the woman question is a really important question. And women in the Catholic Church are an important part of the church. So how do you think, and maybe the answer is not differently at all, have you seen any evidence? Do you see any indication that women in the Catholic Church approach questions of faith and politics and voting any differently than men in the Catholic Church do? And if so, do you have any ideas why?
Yeah, so these are questions that we're interested in at America for political reasons, sociological reasons, journalistic reasons, reasons of faith. And in 2017, we did a poll of 1,500 Catholic women who, it was one of the most comprehensive surveys that has been done on women in the Catholic Church. And we learned a lot about sort of what women in the church believe in terms of how they relate their politics to their faith in particular. And one of the things that we learned was that, that one of the things that was a priority for Catholic women, 80% of them said that a major element of their faith was helping the poor. So that's actually a really good way into both church conversations and politics conversations. And also a good thing to know in terms of evangelization, right, in the church. Like how do we want to bring people into this community, make people feel part of the community, make people feel involved in helping others. And some of the top issues that women said they cared about in terms of politics were care for the environment at 83%, treatment of refugees and migrants at 77%, and abortion at 76%. These were the top issues that they named. But interestingly, despite the fact that some top Catholic issues are the issues that Catholic women, in fact, care most about, there were not a lot of women willing to say that the U.S. bishops or their parish priests actually had any influence on these voting decisions, only 9%. And Pope Francis, 9% of Catholic women we surveyed said that any of these voting decisions had anything to do with the influence of the U.S. bishops or their parish priests, right? Pope Francis had a little more influence. He was 19%. And it was interesting also because you mentioned when we're talking about when we're talking about how they form these opinions, only 12% of Catholic women said that Catholic social teaching helped them decide how to vote. And it was sort of split along party lines and mass attendance. 20% of Republicans said it helped, and 7% of Democrats said it helped. And when you looked at people who went to mass weekly or more, about a quarter of them said that it was helpful. And I mentioned that the last part because when we did the survey, a lot of people, we found out that Catholic women were actually sort of much more disengaged with the church, with their parish, with their prayer life, with any Catholic role models than is we would want them to be, right? That a majority of them were less engaged than maybe we had perceived. And a lot of the reaction was, well, those aren't the real Catholics. Only give us the stats on the people that go to mass weekly or more. That's the only real Catholic. But I argued then, as I argue now, that this is not a particularly helpful way to look at this because anyone who's baptized and says that they're Catholic and baptized in the Catholic Church is Catholic, right? We believe that. And our baptismal role, living out our own baptismal promises means we are meant to be a community that encourages and develops that faith for other people, right? So we all need to develop our faith and mature in our faith, but we do that together. And the other interesting thing about Catholic women and voting, we looked a little bit about where they identify politically. About 6 out of 10 leaned or identified as Democrats, and about 40% identified or leaned Republican. And one interesting thing that comes from this is that in theory, in certain populations or districts, a pro-life Democrat actually could be a competitive general candidate and a competitive candidate in a general election with this base backing it because of the range of issues that that Catholic women support theoretically.
But question, you've told me what doesn't influence Catholic women in terms of voting. Do we know what does? Was there any, I mean, if it's not the bishops, if it's not the priests, if it's not Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this with Mark Gray, who's one of the researchers over at CARA with whom we partnered for the study. One thing he did point out was that people are actually pretty bad at identifying where their influences come from, like overall, so that the fact that a lot of women, their top issues, environment, migration, abortion, align with a lot of what the bishops and Pope Francis and maybe their parish priests are talking about, might indicate that there is a greater influence there than they are sort of identifying. But I think a lot of it comes from the same place everybody else's influence comes from, right? Where are they reading their news, what they're watching on TV, Facebook, social media. This has been brought up a number of times, is that the Catholic population at large, in terms of a voting bloc, is still considered important, but is also increasingly indistinguishable, really, from the general American voter. And so you can say, where are Americans getting their influence from and where they vote? And that's probably the same place most Catholics are.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your remarks, Ms. Weber, and for the remarks of Father Sawyer and Father Malone. I think we've learned a great deal, and we also have, quite a charge. How do we think about our obligations as Catholics in a democratic society where we have, where we're called to participate in the governance as citizens, as sovereigns, and as subjects at the same time by voting? One of the questions, I mean, I realize we're a little bit, we've got to get to the questions and answers of the audience, but one thing I just want to say that, I mean, I don't know if you all agree with this, but, listening to your panel actually kind of concretized this thought in my head. Some people say, well, we're Catholics first, and then we're, Democrats or Republicans second, we're Catholics first. And I understand what people who say that mean. What they're trying to say is that you shouldn't take your faith and put it on a Procrustean bed and cut it down to fit your political commitments. That there's something about your faith that should be prior. I think there's a dangerous way of interpreting that phrase, however, that all three of you have in your own ways kind of fought against. And I think it's very important. I think to say that your faith comes, you're Catholic first, you're Democrat or Republican second, is misleading, because it suggests that we're working on a linear basis and that they're all in the same dimension. That, that first you put your tribe and then you put your political tribe, and then, so that you line up these tribes, and this is the basis of your loyalty. Catholic faith is far more fundamental than that. It's the ground of our worldview. It's the lens through which we view the world. It's how we see other people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. It's not primarily looking in at ourselves. It's giving us a way to look out at the world and to see one another, even especially the most vulnerable, but even those who are vulnerable but also are political antagonists. So I think the most important thing about this panel discussion, at least for me, has been, it's really encouraging reorientation of the question from, are you a Catholic? Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Which comes first, to saying, being a Catholic is living in a world. Being a Catholic is getting a lens for seeing things. It's not simply one political identity alongside others, or even a primary one. It teaches us to pay attention to certain things, and to pray for certain things, and to forgive and reconcile with certain people, namely our enemies, as Jesus taught us, but indeed everyone. So I'd like to thank you all for saying that. And what I'd like to do now is maybe turn to some questions that have come from the audience. Let's see. I've got a question for Father Malone. How exactly are we the cause of polarization? You and I. I mean, that's a kind of a big thing to say. And then what do you mean by that? And then could you say a little more? And then how do you tell if a candidate is serving the common good rather than just satisfying some specific issue in Catholic social teaching? So Father Malone, I'll ask you the question on how do we know, what do you mean by the cause of polarization being you and I? And Father Sawyer, how do you tell if a candidate is furthering the common good rather than just taking some part of Catholic social teaching for their own purposes?
I would just say, I think that's a great question. And so how are each of us in some way a part of the problem? Well, I can offer some answers to that, which I will, but I should say first that that's an answer that's very specific to you as an individual. But generally, I think we can say, how many of us have stopped reading opinions with which we disagree? How many among us have stopped listening to the views of others? How many of us have decided to live in a church or go to a parish where we will find, to live in a neighborhood or go to a parish where we will find people who will only agree with us, who share our view of politics and of the world? How many of us, deep down in those places we don't really like to talk about, get a charge out of, clicking like and showing it to them? And those are the kinds of questions that I think we need to ask. And I'm not saying that all of us are equally responsible for polarization, but every one of us is in some way responsible for it. And unless we're able to own our own piece of it, then it's very hard to know where to begin. And and part of that is, I think, what you were just talking about, and what Ms. Weber was just talking about, which is that this is a mess. You know, we started off with Augustine, right? And we talked about that city of God and that city of man. But you know who belongs to those places in the here and now? It's a mess. It's going to be it's for God to sort out, and He's going to sort it out in the end time. Right now, it is the task of us as both disciples and as citizens to discern the lights from the shadows. It's necessary, and that's why, Professor, to your point, we can't just be Catholics first. We have to be Catholics first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, right? You know, to think of ourselves as Catholics first, then I'm a Republican, then I'm this, is to compartmentalize our faith. And it is to relegate it to a safe and neat compartment. And it has to inform all of us. It has to, I don't know how to stop being a Catholic when I go someplace and am thinking about something. And I don't make a choice to deliberately do it. It's who I am. I've been immersed in this culture and in this world my entire life, and it is the way I see the world. And it's so vitally important to cling to those essentials, because the world is messy, and discerning the lights from the shadows is real work. But that discernment, I think, begins as you know, as it does in every spiritual tradition of the church. It begins with self-examination. What is my role in this? How have I been a part of it? And then how can I be a part of the solution?
Thank you. Now on to something that's a little more tricky in some ways. What do you think on the abortion questions, Father Sawyer?
So this is a question about how to identify which candidate truly supports the common good. Was that?
Let's see. Yes, I'm sorry. It isn't. That isn't. Abortion's coming. Don't worry. How to tell if a candidate is serving the common good rather than just satisfying some specific issue within Catholic social teaching?
So I will, yeah, I'll try to give two approaches to that. The first I would say is that I do think you can sort of look at a candidate's rhetoric, right? Not that rhetoric absolves you of having to think through policy implications, but that there really is a difference between candidates who ask us to do something because of what it will do for all of us together or for other people who are not ourselves, and candidates who appeal only to self-interest, right? Or primarily to self-interest. And I think that is a very good yardstick for how much the basic concept of common good is animating something. I mean, one thing I could hope for is that as a country, or at least as the community of American Catholics, if we could encourage candidates to do a little bit less of an all fight for you and more of a like all work for everybody, we would be closer to candidates who are actually seeking the common good. The second thing I would say, more specifically about how do we tell when somebody's just cherry picking an element out of Catholic social teaching, is that I think that blame goes across the board pretty much in different ways and for different reasons. But to your excellent point about Catholics first, I think one of the things that Catholics first language tends to do is it lets us think that we are done with political questions as they relate to our faith once we have identified the party or candidate who is least terrible from the perspective of the faith. When the question we should be asking is, why is it the case that neither party is actually dealing with the full range of issues in Catholic social teaching, and that Catholics within those parties don't seem to be able to push them in that direction, right? Why is it the case that we have a Republican Party where candidates are passionate about their defense of the dignity of unborn life and celebrating federal executions resuming, right? And saying terrible things about our brothers and sisters at the southern border? Why is it the case that we have a Democratic Party that is very passionate about helping the poor and the cause of advancing racial justice, and yet is drumming pro-life Democrats out of the party at every primary? Those two things show us that, being Catholic first and then picking a party is, step one of maybe 20 in what Catholic political participation should look like. If we really want to advance the common good, I think more of the work has to be done within parties to try to advocate for a broader perspective from partisans who we're already cooperating with on other issues.
That's very insightful, and it's also really good to be a moderator in this conversation, because the questions you just asked, Father Sawyer, I'm actually going to put a version of them to Ms. Weber to answer. One of the questions that came in on our board is, will the U.S. Church ever value the environment and the death penalty as true pro-life issues when it comes to politics? If it did, neither party would be viewed wholly as pro-life. Do you think the U.S. Church values the environment and the not the death penalty, but probably the abolition of the death penalty, I'm assuming here, as true pro-life issues when it comes to politics? And if not, how would you encourage people to adopt? And I guess what's behind this question really is a question of development of doctrine. The Church's teaching on abortion is long-standing, but as Catholics, we believe in the magisterium of the Church. We also believe in a kind of development of moral doctrine. And we've seen that in the new concern that's expressed about the environment. And we've seen that, even more concretely in terms of moving toward, quite a firm opposition to the death penalty in magisterial teaching. So how do you get the Church to accept some of these new insights into eternal truth?
Yeah, I think starting with how you're defining church as well. Like, do you mean what the bishops are saying? Do you mean what people are talking about in the pews? Do you mean what people who sort of are tangentially a part of the church but aren't in the parish are thinking about? Or just what people think that the church is thinking about? It's because I think that if you go to certain parishes, you're going to find a lot about this. You're going to find people who have enacted groups that are based entirely on Laudato Si, right? You're going to find people writing letters to people on death row. You're going to find people who have put in greener parish centers and tried to have a more eco-friendly parish life. There's people who are really, truly embracing a lot of these teachings that and that Pope Francis has put front and center. So I think hopefully we can be encouraged by that Pope Francis, he saw fit to write an encyclical on the environment. He's made sure that people understand, or has made clear, whether or not people are understanding it right now, that the death penalty is not acceptable in the United States right now anymore. There's no situation in which it needs to happen. And that's now part of the catechism. I think the real question is, how do you help these things move from documents to real life, which is I think part of what is being asked here. And the bishops have recently spoken out strongly against the federal death penalty, which has been very encouraging. And I look forward to the new encyclical from Pope Francis coming out soon that may be able to tie some of these together about fraternal relationship. And because I think that these are all tied up in that. They're questions of how we work together for and support the flourishing of one another. And so I think there may be some more direction there. I think one challenge, though, is that the documents, however beautifully written, are still documents, right? They're not necessarily an enticing thing for someone to just pick up and read, however beautifully written they may be. And so we have to work, I think, probably at the parish level most often to translate those documents into actual lived daily life and parish life and understanding of those things. And that's where I think that the church, as the people of God, will see the most potential growth around these issues as we grapple with them together, and don't just wait for someone to sort of tell us what to do on them.
Great. I said I would come back to an abortion question, and it's an abortion question that I think each of you might have a slightly different angle on. So I will ask it. Quote, I grew up in a family that prayed the rosary at Planned Parenthood and was very involved in anti-abortion efforts. As I have grown up and had varied life experiences, I've come to see abortion in gray tones. It is not a black and white or an all or nothing game. There are so many lives and issues at stake. How can I talk to my family who continue to see it as an all or nothing game? So we've got a question of morality, we've got a question of politics, we've got a question of talking to families, we've got a question of engaging with people who disagree. It's what we in law school teaching would call an issue spotter. So Father Malone, I'll let you start and we'll go down the line.
Yeah, I would say that, look, there are different ways that you can talk about this issue. And at some point we need to use all of them. But you know, there's the philosophical case, there's the case from the magisterial teaching of the church, and there's the case, I think, to be made from the general intuition that most human beings have about the value of human life, right? And so, and then there's the place from personal story. And so I think in interpersonal settings, the most effective way to respond is to tell that story that you just alluded to, which is the story of your own journey in your understanding of this issue. That you're presumably, I think, from the question, holding fast to the value that's at the heart of it. But like a lot of reasonable and very good people, you are struggling to apprehend how that value is to be applied in the contemporary world, given the breadth of experience that that you have had, and so you are not alone. That is what every Catholic in this country is doing. We are taking this tradition, which we have received as gift, as a life-giving gift, and we are, like every generation before us, I should say, struggling to figure out how to apply that in this messy world in which we're living. And I think that it just gives me another opportunity to say one other thing, which is, you know, sometimes when I talk about, you know, identifying our own complicity and polarization and so forth, people think that I'm scolding them from the pulpit or something. But what I'm really trying to say is something that's empowering. You know, as Ms. Weber alluded to, the most important question that we face as a church right now at a fundamental level is, what is the church? What do we mean when we say that, right? Because there are a lot of people who just mean the bishops, and you know that whether they're on the left so-called or on the right so-called, that's a form of clericalism, right? There are, you know, when people say to me often enough, you know, the church is anti-gay, and I think to myself, well, what do you mean by the church? The church's magisterium has certain teachings about human sexuality and so forth, but Catholics nationwide are the Christian group that was most likely to support domestic partnerships and eventually gay marriage. And there are lots of parishes throughout this country where there are gay people and gay families living and worshiping. And it's almost certain that every one of us has been ministered to by somebody who was gay or lesbian or bisexual. But even more than that, you are the church. When in that moment, when you are in conversation with your family, you are the church. And when you're speaking to somebody who isn't Catholic, who's wondering why the Catholic Church is saying this or doing that, at that moment, you are the church entirely to them, right? I think it's important to recover a sense that being church is a personal reality, because it comes to us from not some God who's far away and uninvolved, but who actually became a person, right? He has a name. And if we can bring that personal element to all of our interactions at whatever level is appropriate for that space, then I think that'll change the way in which we interact.
That's wonderful. Father Sawyer, do you have a few words you'd like to add to
Sure.
Father Malone's perspective?
Well, I'm going to try to provide some, I think, some pretty concrete advice, which comes from my own experience of writing about the topic of abortion frequently, and also engaging people in dialogue on social media, which, you know, as terrible as it can be, there is honestly sometimes the possibility for conversation there. And I've, you know, my experience has been when I write about this topic, that I fairly regularly get attacked both from the pro-choice and the pro-life side. So people who think I'm insufficiently clear about being opposed to abortion, and also people who think I am, you know, just an ideologue out to win, you know, get Roe v. Wade knocked down at any cost. And so the concrete suggestion I would have for how to talk to somebody across this gulf is to do the work yourself of naming the best possible motive for the person who disagrees with you. And then try to do the work of helping them name that motive for the people they disagree with. Let me specify that a little bit more. There's these frequent tropes in any discussion of abortion where, you know, pro-lifers will often say about people who support abortion, they're baby killers, or, you know, they just, you know, like Planned Parenthood wants to profit off abortion as much as possible. And I can say, from having actually talked to people on that side of the issue, I have literally never met someone about whom that is actually true, right? And the actual motives people who defend abortion rights come into the conversation with are about women's autonomy and about how to protect women's ability to make choices about their own body, this situation that is morally unique to abortion, right? Where the life we want to protect exists inside the life and body of another human being. And on the flip side, you know, what's often said by pro-choicers about pro-lifers is something like, well, they just want to control women's bodies, or, you know, they don't care about the child after it's born. And I can say from deep experience in the pro-life movement, I also literally have never met anyone about whom that is true, right? That the motive really is about the dignity and value of the life of these unborn human persons, these unborn human beings who deserve some part of recognition in the human family. And if you can do the work of trying to name, even for the person you disagree with passionately, the good motive that they're speaking from, I think that gets us a long way towards being able to disagree well. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to let us actually disagree about what we're disagreeing about, instead of disagreeing with the caricature that is simply the worst possible version of the thing I don't believe.
Okay, Carrie Weber.
Yeah, so I agree very much with Sam in terms of asking that question of motive. I find that it's really useful to try to figure out first, as you're discussing with someone, why they believe that. Sometimes they have incorrect information, right? Sometimes there's literally a misunderstanding of what's happening. Sometimes there's a personal experience there that that person does not want to name, but is driving them, and that you might be able to get to through honest conversation. And I also really want to commend the question writer for wanting to talk to their family about this, because it is a really hard conversation to have with anybody, and sometimes even more difficult with family than with strangers. And I just think that's really a very good and heartening thing for me to know that somebody wants to do, to be honest. And it's I find it actually a very scary topic to talk about with people that I know sometimes, particularly if I know that there's going to be a strong disagreement, because people make a lot of assumptions, as Sam was saying, about your own motivations, about what other things you might believe because of that, and I or others make those assumptions about other people. So a lot of the issues begin to tie together, and people think, well, if you believe this, you must believe X, Y, and Z, and all these things. And therefore, it leads to this sense of like, you are the enemy representing all the issues that I disagree with. And whenever I'm talking with somebody with whom I disagree, and I find myself sort of leaning toward the I really dislike this person rather than I really disagree on this issue, I try to think about the quote from Dorothy Day of I really only love God as much as the person I love the least, which I find really, really jarring sometimes, because sometimes there are people that I really strongly dislike, and it doesn't say much about how much I love God if that is the equivalent of my love for God. So I find it's useful sometimes to challenge myself to be, open and charitable in these conversations as much as I can be.
That's wonderful, and we're just about at our ending time. I could take another question, but I think since it's 7:23 and we have till 7:24 to end on that beautiful note, with such, I think, wisdom and sensitivity on the part of all three panelists is a good place to stop. I'd really like to thank, not only Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry for sponsoring this event, but for America Magazine and its editors, Father Malone, Father Sawyer, and Miss Carrie Weber, to come up and virtually and spend some time with us and educate us on how to maybe think more fruitfully about our identities and our commitments in a very fraught political time. So at this point, I am going to send this back to Megan Lovett so that she can thank you all again properly, and also provide a little bit of orientation as we close this fabulous session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I echo Dr. Kaveny in thanking our panelists, and also for our moderator today for our wonderful presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. We're so glad that you were able to join us this evening. Just a reminder, there are 6 additional opportunities for you to participate in our webinars. Our next one is next Thursday, October 1st. It's at the same time, and it's with Father Michael Rozier. His webinar is entitled Public Health and Public Faith, Life During a Pandemic. The follow-up email that we're going to send you tomorrow will include a link to register for the webinars. Feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, concerns, and again, we thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you to our panelists and moderator. We hope that you have a great rest of your day. Take care.